Trading card games, as you all know, usually, especially ones made in Japan, have a bit of a release lag between their language versions, except for Magic. Magic is the one exception because it's an American-made card game, and of course it has its simultaneous releases all over the world, but a lot of Japanese card games, and ones that we usually play on this channel, have a bit of a release lag between Japanese and English. So for Vanguard's case, it usually goes like, we'll have a release, let's say in April in Japan, and it'll be out in June or July in English. Sometimes in May, you know, it usually feels like the further we are away from Chinese New Year, the closer the release dates are. And the right after Chinese New Year is where the biggest gap is because of like a lot of shipping delays happening because of Chinese New Year. But it's basically like a 2-ish month gap between that. Pokemon actually also has had quite a big release gap too. So Pokemon for the most part has had a release gap, and especially sometimes it's really bad where I think especially recently it's been a few months apart, but there have been times, especially last year, where a pre-release for a set in English would happen on the same week that a Japanese release would happen. So you'd be seeing English versions of the cards at the same time or even before some of the Japanese versions of the cards, because sometimes you'd see like, you know, somebody would just take pictures of the pre-release or something like that. So even the biggest card game in the world, Pokemon, has a delay between English and Japanese, which is pretty huge because that's a company that can definitely afford to sync up releases, but they choose not to. And of course, for us in Bushiroad games, and especially in Vanguard, we're always kind of asking like, come on, lower the gap, lower the gap. We want to play a non-solved format. A lot of people that play Japanese card games in English are always asking for this because you're basically picking up from where the Japanese format left off and innovating beyond that, which is also a fun experience. And it, like, especially in the case of games like Digimon, you oftentimes have the English format be completely different from Japanese because the English players just choose to play completely different strategies. And I think that's really, really cool. And Digimon allows you to do that. But there was a really big announcement just a couple weeks ago that I think will potentially change the card game industry forever. And what is that announcement? It is, of course, simultaneous releases for Digimon. So Bandai, of all companies, went out of their way to basically announce that, you know, they had their worlds and all that kind of stuff, but they basically announced that they will be having simultaneous releases worldwide from spring 2025. So there's still a year left for this, but this is not just simultaneous releases between English and Japanese. This is also simultaneous between the Chinese edition of the game too. They are syncing up 3 language versions, which is very impressive. But of course, this is not gonna be a very easy task. So they actually went over how they're planning to do this too. So I'm actually gonna show you here. So, you know, it's pretty easy to look at it through numbers. BT means booster set. So this is the English version at the top, and this is the Japanese version at the bottom here, right? So you can see here, BT16 comes out in May for English. It's already out in Japan. BT17 comes out in August for English, and the Extra Booster 7 comes out in September 2024. Extra Booster 7 comes out in May in Japan. So you can see how big the gap is here, right? You see how big it is, right? September to May, 4-month gap between releases here. Despite a 4-month gap, they are still doing this. That means there is no excuse if your gap between releases is smaller than 4 months, is what I'm trying to say here, okay? So you see here, we have set 18 in Japanese. Oh, it's not there. Special Booster version 2.0. And then BT19, BT20 are all basically, these 3 sets are basically pushed into these 2 sets. So they're taking 3 sets and putting them into 2 instead, which I think is very interesting. And I think these sets are most likely designed with that in mind. So you see that BT17 will still come out in English, and this is a very thematic set that you shouldn't combine with anything else. But they're most likely releasing these next 3 sets as ones that are okay to combine and mix and match around, so that the English, and I assume the Chinese version, can release them like this. This will most likely affect pull rates. This will most likely affect card prices. This will have some negatives in the short term. The card prices for these cards that are in these sets will probably be different from what they usually are in English. However, this has such big long-term implications that I think it is very much worth it, right? So you can see here, right, the gap is pretty huge. April starter deck release in Japan is September in English. 5 months. 5-month gap. And despite a 5-month gap, they are still condensing it. They are still condensing it. So they're showing here exactly what these version 2 and 2.5 boosters are. So version 2 combines 18 and 19, and then 2.5 picks up the remaining bits of 19 and 20. So English will have a very unique, its own like card pool for this time. But then going forward in April, they are syncing up the releases. Everything will release at the same time from April onwards, right? And that makes things like competing very exciting, right? It makes coming up with cards and decks and ideas so much more interesting. But my emphasis here is that the gap is like 4 to 5 months. Despite a 4 to 5 month gap, they are choosing to do this. And now there's a whole, you can actually watch whole documentaries about how English version of Japanese card games are made, right? There's actually a Coffee with Bushiroad video on the official Bushiroad channel with Terrence from Bushiroad, who goes over the process of making these, you know, localizations for Japanese card games, and especially when they do English exclusive versions of cards too. And it's a very time-taking process. It's easy to make mistakes. It's easy, if a last-minute change is made to a card in Japanese, and then, for example, that's not communicated to the English department, you just have to make an errata, right? It can be a mess. So you have to have really good cooperation between the English and Japanese and Chinese, Korean, whichever department of the game, because otherwise you're gonna have problems, right? So this shows that not only are they trying this out, and actually, the most important thing is they could have done this quietly. They could have quietly announced this without any implication. They're just like, oh, we're gonna be combining sets 18, 19, full stop. But instead, they chose to loud and proud say that they are going to sync up releases, which makes every single other company in the card game industry look a little worse. Because Bandai, the ones that have been constantly told, it's like, oh, you're the guys that always end your card games, you can't be trusted with anything. Well, they can be trusted to shake up the entire card game industry, because they will make it so that you don't have to rely on Japanese results anymore. You can explore and figure out these formats together all over the world and not just look at what Japan does. For me, this becomes a little bit harder because, a lot of what I do on the channel is looking at what things happen in Japan and that kind of like reported to the West. But now it's going to be even cooler if this happens to Vanguard, right? Because then I would be able to do like, oh, here's results from a BCS and a WGP. Let's see the differences between English and Japanese, right? And it's a much more like constant development thing and not just a, hey, here's what happened in Japan, but it's also kind of different. You can pick this up in English and try to do something with it, So I think it would be overall very beneficial for us Bushiroad card gamers too, whether that's Vanguard or Shadowverse Evolve. Vice is a bit difficult because of licensing, so I don't think Vice could ever have this, but at least for Vanguard. At the very least for Vanguard, the Vanguard gap is not that big. Shadowverse Evolve's gap is a year, so it would take a bit of time for them to get there, and it's also very hard to combine Shadowverse Evolve sets because they're very thematically designed, right? So it's a little tough, but at least for Vanguard, where the gap is really small, I think this should be possible, and I think that as a company, Bushiroad should really be thinking about how this could be done. And apparently there's also a One Piece announcement coming up soon. I think if Bandai announces this same thing for One Piece, then every other company has to start rethinking their priorities. Because if One Piece, the card game that is basically threatening to join the big three right now, and potentially become one of the big three, potentially, if One Piece makes that announcement, I think every company has to start reevaluating things. Konami especially, I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh's gap is insane, right? Yu-Gi-Oh's, chat, remind me how big is Yu-Gi-Oh's gap between releases? To me, it looks like 6 months. To me, it looks like half a year. I get a new Yu-Gi-Oh card in Japanese and I don't see it come out in English for like half a year usually, I feel like. Is it that much or is it less than that? Because Vanguard, it feels like compared to Yu-Gi-Oh is not that bad. But then Pokemon is very weird because Pokemon sometimes is really close. It's really like 1 week apart sometimes, and then sometimes like 3-4 months. So I don't really understand what they're doing over at Pokemon. I really do feel like they should be uniting. I mean, this might push the Pokemon company to unite releases too, right? But I wonder if they will do it loud and proud the way Bandai does. I think Bandai saying it out loud to the entire industry that we can do this is what is very much worth of respect. And I think that that is exactly what is really, really impressive. Oh, Yu-Gi-Oh is about 3 to 4 months. Oh, it felt like more, but that's good. Maybe they're catching up a little bit. So maybe Konami can do this too one day. Bushiroad, don't fall behind. We gotta catch up. So honestly, huge up to Bandai. I do play Bandai card games here and there. I did take a year break from Digimon, but I came back recently, and I picked up One Piece recently. I do think Bandai card games in the current era are quite good. I used to be one of the people that didn't trust Bandai with card games because they ended a lot of the card games I liked. They ended Gundam War, they ended the Granblue Fantasy card game, and they've ended plenty of other card games in the past too, including Digimon and I don't know if they've ever done a One Piece card game before, but, you know, there's definitely been card games that they've ended that I wasn't too happy about, and I felt a bit shaky going into Digimon initially, but it's been a few years now, and things are looking pretty good and looking to get even better going forward into the future. So let me know your thoughts as well, what you think about these releases syncing up, and if you think other companies should be doing this too. Do you agree with me that Vanguard should be synced up, or do you like the gap between English and Japanese and seeing card reveals that don't mean anything to you until 2-3 months later? But I personally would like them to unite, because I think it'd be cool if we could all be excited about the same things coming out all together. Yeah, Bandai's PR rehabilitation has been insane. They definitely went from the least trusted TCG company to by far one of the best, which is pretty crazy. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and of course, if you like this video, give it a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I really do want to reach 100k one day, and I need your support to do that. If you're a Bandai friend watching this, hey, why not join the channel? I mean, I have a second channel where I have recently started to upload again on, by the way. I upload stuff for Bandai card games, so you can check that out over there. Stop the gap, that's right. And if you want to support the channel in other ways, you can become a YouTube channel member to unlock some exclusive bonus content as well, which really helps support the channel. But with that, that is going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.